Oh, I'm so glad that you all are here, and I'm so grateful to continue the conversation. Um, Again, if you're joining us for the first time, if you missed the morning session, we're going to be utilizing the Q&A tab at the bottom of the window. If you have any questions that you'd like to add, please try, if you've got questions, put them there as opposed to putting them in the chat box, because we can't guarantee that we're going to see everything that comes through the chat box.
It goes past really quickly.
And feel free to engage each other in the chat box as much as you want to. Be respectful. We're all going to end up in heaven together is the main thing. I'm going to go ahead and make an introduction to our two plenary speakers. The very Reverend James Turrell was appointed Dean of the School of Theology at Sewanee last July, where he has taught liturgic since 2002. His publications include the 2013 volume Celebrating the Rites of Initiation. He serves on the Standing Commission on Liturgy and Music and the House of Bishops Theology Committee. And you can find his web-based project on worship across the Episcopal Church at Episcopal Liturgy, all one word, episcopalliturgy.org. And I'd also want to welcome Dr. Liza Anderson, who is an assistant professor of theology and religious studies at the College of St. Scholastica in Duluth, Minnesota. Liza is active in ecumenical and interreligious dialogue and the governance of the Episcopal Church. A former member of the SCLM, she currently serves on the Executive Council. And her forthcoming volume concerns recent revisions to calendars of commemorations in different Christian traditions. Jim, I'd like to start with you, if you don't mind. You said in a sermon preached at All Saints Chapel in 2014, the following: "Our job as clergy is always to be icons, to point beyond ourselves to the one who called us to his ministry, the one who is the way, the truth, and life itself. That's the same reason we will remember those who have gone before us." How does the calendar of the church year help to point beyond ourselves to Christ?
From my perspective, one of the most important features of any of the folks that we choose to remember is their heroic witness. In a sense, they're only in the calendar because their life in some way reflected more perfectly, I was about to say, a closer approximation of the reflection of Christ himself and than you or I. And so they're an exemplar of the Christian faith. They embody Christian virtues, and they often, if we think back to the way that the calendar originates, it originates with the remembrance of the martyrs. And so, in a sense, Stephen the proto-martyr is the great sort of archetype of what a saint can be, someone who is pointing to Christ. So to me, the calendar is the collection of these heroic figures who have pointed beyond themselves to Christ. John the Baptist would be the other, in some ways, great archetype of a saint, the one who points to the one, in his case, who came after him. I do think that the other feature for me is the collection of family stories. And so icons in the sense of family photos as well, with the stories that give us an identity and ground us in our Christian faith. For me, my experience growing up as a cradle Episcopalian was I didn't have a great sense of rootedness in the faith. I got to the college chaplaincy at Yale, and as an undergrad, I started going to the Episcopal Church at Yale's daily Eucharist, where before the service started, there would be a reading of the bio of whoever was the saint that day in lesser feasts and fasts. And this was me learning the family stories that I had been unable to access, hadn't heard for 18 years of life until that point. So the stories, the narrative also points, I think, towards Christ.
Liza, you wrote in a blog post last or summer before last the following: I am enough of an Anglo-Catholic that I am more or less content for us to continue wantonly adding people to the calendar every 3 years, so long as they are all actually Christians and are all definitely dead. But I do nevertheless think that Article 22 should, at the very least, challenge us to ask why this sudden proliferation of saints has flourished over the last couple of decades. What work is it doing for us? Does this ever-growing list of intercessors and exemplars enhance our worship of God, or does it detract from it? And I think these are both very useful questions to ask as we approach the revision of the church calendar. How do the saints help us in our worship of God?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it's an interesting question because I don't think there's one universal answer to it. And I know that we'll get to this later on this afternoon, but I think one of the reasons that calendar revision has proven so fraught is that Anglicans and Episcopalians use the calendar in a wide range of different ways. So for some people, the primary purpose of the character really is pedagogical. This is the way that we're learning church history as lay people in our parishes. And, if you don't take a formal course in church history, maybe hearing the biographies of these people in the context of the Eucharist is the only real instruction in church history you ever get. On the other hand, you really do have the sense that these are people who intercede with us to God. And, for me, especially actually at a time when my church is not gathering either in person or actually on Zoom, everything is pre-recorded. I've had a strong sense this past year that weirdly, I'm sort of closer to the church triumphant than to the church militant. And the saints are sort of in that sense a very real presence in my life in terms of the actual community of people who praise with me. And that it's not just about sort of either me alone in my apartment or me alone in my parish church, but in either sense that we're part of a church that's much larger, right? I mean, we talk a lot about church decline, but actually when you remember that the church includes the dead as well as the living, the church can't ever shrink. The church can only ever grow. So there is this sense that everything we're doing here is only a little bit of a microcosm of a much greater cloud of witnesses. And our worship is joined with them, as well as there being examples to whom we look for patterns of Christian life.
That's so interesting. I've found myself in the pandemic and also in this period of social unrest and striving for justice in new ways. I found myself going back more and more to history and more to sort of narrative history, sort of the story history, because everything seems so right, in my face right now. It's hard to maintain that long view of almost anything. And as we were saying earlier in this morning's session, this is a moment that exists, and it is not an eternal moment. The church will move beyond where we are right now to another place. And so I resonate with what you're saying, Liza, about that feeling of actual communion with the saints and connection with the saints. And it sort of leads to a question which we will now spend the rest of our time together with this perhaps question. What is the history of the calendar of the church year? And you two are both brilliant historians as well as liturgists, and I would love for you to talk to each other about that.
Liza, you want to take pre-Cranmer and I'll pick up then, or how do we want to divvy up the first bit?
Yeah, I don't know. In some ways, I was more prepared to talk 20th century, but I mean, we
Okay.
can do it
Well,
however we want.
yeah, I mean, so and Liza, you correct me as needed. Um, the early history is you remember folks on the dates of their martyrdoms, right? The original saints were all martyrs, and it was customary you remembered them on the date of their birth into eternal life, right? And so you have a variety of practices around that, including collecting the leftover bits of those who'd been martyred, whatever you could recover from the Romans, which is where you get the origins of relics. You have the remembrance of the departure date, for lack of a better term. And then as folks move through the Roman Empire and connect with Christian communities in other parts of the empire, they take with them the saints that they had remembered in their place of origin. And so gradually you have this sort of pan-imperial calendar growing up. And then eventually, when you stop martyring Christians and Christians become the ones in charge, you have to look for other models of heroic sanctity, right? And then they too get added with the date of their death. Uh, and and finally, what happens over the course of the Middle Ages is that you've added so many to the calendar that you have, in some cases, dueling feasts on the same calendrical date. Um, and Cranmer inherits this, looks at it, and says, we're going to clean all of this up. This is too complicated. And Cranmer's great project was, in many ways, creating a daily office lectionary so you would read as much scripture as possible over the course of the year. It becomes a program in Bible study as much as anything else. And you really minimize the disruptions to that calendar by doing what Cranmer did, as many disruptions to the Bible program and the cycle of the daily office, reading in sequence through the books of the Bible by minimizing the number of feasts. The other thing along with this, though, is what Liza was alluding to in Article 22, right, which is that the invocation of saints is highly problematic, right? So what you do with the saints can be problematic in the old order. There were certain saints that the Tudors wanted to get rid of, like Thomas Becket, who wasn't a fan of royal authority, right? And then you have the complexity of the calendar that's a problem. And so Cranmer whittles it down essentially to just the biblical saints, right? And then gradually you see, after that 1549 paring down, you see this gradual addition over time, where you get 4 saints' days added in 1552, right? St. George, go team, if you're the Church of England. Lammas Day, St. Lawrence, St. Clement. Then you get in 1559 state occasions added in. But the line between church and state in Tudor England is cloudy at best, right? So Elizabeth's accession date, November 17th, is added with a little prayer service, because that's God delivering England from the clutches of Roman Catholics, right, in the rhetoric of the time. Then you add gunpowder treason, right, Guy Fawkes Day, after, again, another deliverance from the clutches, et cetera, et cetera. 1662, it's delivering England from the clutches of the parliamentarians when they add May 29th, the date of Charles I's return to England and his birthday, or Charles II, rather, his birthday and return to England. And then Charles I's martyrdom is a day of fasting, right? January 30th. So you see this gradual expansion of the calendar harnessed to these very particular, often political needs. 1789, the Americans get rid of those English saints. St. George, not a big deal. You add Thanksgiving Day. Transfiguration is added 1892, but that's really a major, that's not a saint. 1928, they add Independence Day. Finally, in 1928, we've made peace with the fact that the English have been kicked out. they add a generic set of saints propers. It's really when you get to 1979 that you have this massive expansion of lesser feasts, right? So 79 is a revolutionary per book in a lot of ways, but not least in the way it handles the calendar. And then every general convention after, we seem to add more folks to that calendar of lesser feasts. And we tried a cleanup, or actually it wasn't really a cleanup, rationalization in 2009 with Holy Women, Holy Men. And then 2015 was an attempt at a cleanup with Great Cloud of Witnesses and saying, well, these are not saints per se, these are heroes and part of our history, but that's really about it. And then 2018, there was the proposal that went to General Convention that would have pruned back because what Holy Women, Holy Men and Great Cloud did was even more of an expansion of the calendar. So once again, like late medieval Roman Catholic calendars pre-Cranmer, you had dueling feasts on the same day. 2018 was an attempt to pare that back. It was a Cranmerian sort of move, and it landed with something of a thud at General Convention. And so then that's where we are now. But Liza, you can correct me on all the 20th century errors that I've just made.
Please.
Yeah, well, let me just fill in some things in general. That was all super helpful. One thing that might be worth saying, because not everyone may know, is that for a lot of that ancient and medieval history, you know, canonization was much more ad hoc, and it really was just local cults springing up, communities choosing to worship people. It wasn't that you had sort of a top-down process of figuring out in some sort of, you know, official ecclesiastical way who is and who isn't a saint. That's a much later medieval development. And
well, and really formalized with Trent, right? I mean, that's where it
yeah.
really gets structured. Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things that's been interesting is like we keep trying actually as Anglicans to give that agency back to local communities, and they almost never want it, right? So like technically, according to our actual guidelines, you're supposed to start with a local cult and only then seek formal recognition. And for whatever reason, people seem like very skittish about that. And it's like, no, we're actually telling you that not only do you have the right to do this, this is actually the way this works, is that, you know, you start locally and only then do we add something to the formal calendar. The other interesting thing with some of those earlier Anglican characters to me is that they never had a coherent theology of sainthood. You know, even Cranmer's calendars, it's like he strips a lot away, but then you just get random people in there who definitely never existed. And by 1662, you've got mostly biblical people, but then also like random bishops and 11 virgin martyrs, some of whom like also dubious historicity. So then it's like, okay, what is this? Is this a coherent theology of sainthood? The thing that gets interesting is that, you know, a lot of our own 20th century calendar revision, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. So the 1958 Lambeth Conference actually has a bunch of resolutions talking about this within the wider Anglican context, as a bunch of provinces are sort of looking at expansion of the calendar, trying to decide who gets in, what does this look like, what's the process, what should a calendar be? And I think part of that, okay, so a lot of this sort of like late 20th century stuff, it comes from a place of wanting to diversify the calendar. I mean, you know, Lesser Feast and Fast 2006, it's a calendar that's mostly white male bishops. But you could look at that, and some people did, from a sense of like, well, this isn't just some sort of like politically correct quota system. That's not how sainthood works. I would look at that and say, well, if we're actually recognizing people because of holiness of life rather than because of importance in church history, then one actually would assume that the graces of the Holy Spirit are going to be equitably distributed based on things like race, ordination status, gender, time period. And so if you have a calendar that's not, to me, the redress doesn't need to happen because, you know, we didn't have saints in these categories and now we need to like create them so that they'll be balanced. It's more likely that like, we've probably been missing people because, you know, if this is actually a document where we recognize people for heroism of Christian witness, one assumes that does not disproportionately belong to white male bishops. One assumes. And so there is this sense where in 2003, actually, the Episcopal Church passed a resolution saying that as part of diversifying our calendar, we need to look back through church history. We need to look at our ecumenical partners. We need to look at other Anglican communion provinces. And we need to make sure the calendar looks more like the people of God, not because it's a quota system, but because if we're truly looking for witnesses of Christian life, that actually probably should look different than the calendar we ended up with all along. And the last thing I'll add, which is just super interesting, is that a lot of Protestant churches have been going through this in the 20th century. And, most people know me. I don't really think of Anglicans as being Protestants. I know some would disagree with that. But, you have Lutherans, Methodists, even Presbyterians now developing calendars of commemorations and traditions that never had such a thing.
Somewhere Oliver Cromwell is passing out.
Yeah, probably. And, the Church of England has done major revision with, I do have to say, the worst titled liturgical book ever, Exciting Holiness, which, makes it sound like it's sort of broccoli or something. And you're like, exciting holiness, But, for all our calendar wars and sort of the torture that we've been through with the church over this, this is not some kind of Episcopal bubble that we're just going through our own internal drama here. Like, this actually is something that just sort of 20th and early 21st century Christians are dealing with and trying to determine, like, what is this thing? And is the kind of calendar we've inherited, does it match the theology we claim the calendar has?
And I'm not sure as you say, I'm not sure we've ever had a consistent theology of the calendar, and we certainly don't today. And if you think of the confusion that arises like clockwork every 12 months, on November 1st and 2nd, right? Who are we observing on All Saints' Day? And depending on how the observance goes in your community, what do you have left for All Souls' Day the next day?
Yeah.
The liturgical thing that I've witnessed in the past is at the burial of the dead and the intercessions, when it comes to the commemoration of a saint, which is optional in the commemorations, people invariably will say the name of the deceased.
Yeah.
Which, it is kind of either a mistake or an innovation. It's hard to tell.
And if you sort of go, crawling back through the tradition, right? I mean, there's something Pauline about the saints who are in Corinth, right? All of the holy people who are in Corinth, but the church pretty soon afterwards began to interpret that a little bit differently, so that you have, Thecla remembered as being particularly heroic. You have the collection of the bits of the martyrs, and so whatever pristine Pauline image of all the believers are saints, are the holy ones. It sort of becomes a yeah, but, and sort of like baseball, you've got your major leagues, and then you have your AAA and AA coming out from that.
Well, and I would say too, not only has the church historically distinguished between these categories, but to me, the wonderful thing about having All Saints and All Souls Day as really separate things is the difference in liturgical mood. Yeah, so it's not that the people on All Souls are necessarily in like an ontologically different category, but the mood of the day is very different. And I really hate it when I'm in places where they're conflated, because I actually want to have All Souls Day as a place to grieve. Yeah. And, like All Saints Day, it's like, we're just sort of like celebrating the richness of Christian witness in history. And I'm not at all sad that they're dead, because it's been like a century or more and I never knew them. And, we can just sort of like rejoice in their witness. But when you're talking about people that we've personally known, it's a very different mood, and we celebrate them in a different kind of way, because celebration is tinged with grief and it's all intertwined. And I think that that's actually healthy. And in some ways, you get sort of a toxic positivity with trying to celebrate all of our dearly departed loved ones as part of All Saints Day, where you don't allow people the space they actually need to process grief.
Well, and again, from the historical standpoint, maybe we're coming full circle back to Article 22, where you started us off, Liza, right? Because All Saints was, the anniversary of the commemoration of the Pantheon is the Church for All the Saints, right? And it's essentially covering any saint that we have left out of the calendar by accident because they were not known to us, but yet they had heroic sanctity in the eyes of the Almighty. Whereas All Souls was about getting folks through purgatory a little bit faster. And if we hew to Article 22, we don't necessarily need the intercession of those saints that we had overlooked, and there's not a place to speed you through. Now, of course, anyone who's ever flown in the southeastern US and connected in Atlanta knows that purgatory exists, but that's a whole different matter.
And I would be the first to want to stress that the article only prohibits us believing in the Romish doctrine of purgatory, and the Anglican doctrine of purgatory is completely fine. And basically, I would argue just means you can't buy your way out with money. But I'm
somewhere St. John Henry Newman is looking down and smiling on you, Liza.
Oh my goodness. There's a question that's actually come up in the Q&A, which is related to what we've been talking about. And I'd love to hear each of your opinions about it. When modifying the calendar, this is from Mark Neighbors, by the way, when modifying the calendar, especially when adding saints, what obligations might we have to other Christian communions and the larger church? How might we negotiate this larger view with local, national, and denominational observances?
Yeah. Well, let me start by saying that, like, one thing that I think there's been a lot of debate about within the church is the appropriateness of adding sort of non-Anglican saints to our calendar. I personally am very in favor of it because I think that, like, it's a weird sort of use of a calendar to turn it into a statement of denominational identity, as if our denominational differences perdure in the eschaton, and, as if Jesus is coming back to marry an entire harem of churches. And so here he's got his Anglican bride and over there is his Catholic bride, etc. There definitely, though, there are many people within the Episcopal Church who really do see the calendar as an expression of our identity as Anglicans, and who really do want it to be an Anglican document that privileges English saints and then post-Reformation Anglicans. And I do understand that. But at the end of the day, I think I have to fall down on, if it's a sanctoral calendar, denominations ultimately have no meaning in the Church Triumphant. And so I actually think it's an important witness of what a calendar is, that it's not just Anglican. But in terms of obligations to other churches, one of the things that I know we were very cautious about is, adding people from other communions who don't necessarily want to be on our calendar, right? If someone is from a very low church Protestant tradition, they may have a wonderful heroic witness. Do they want them asking? Do they want us asking for their intercession at an Anglican Eucharist? Maybe not, right? So there is a kind of ecumenical sensitivity there, where, in a certain sense, you do want to affirm these people as part of, the Church Triumphant that we all recognize, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the most ecumenically sensitive thing to slap them on our calendar and just be like, oh, Mennonites and Quakers, we're really sorry for persecuting you, and so now you have your feast day, because that's our Anglican way of saying sorry. When, like, if that's not part of their tradition, that may not be a reparation that they appreciate.
Well, and then there are the folks who wouldn't say that we were a real church anyway, not to mention Newman or, say, Chesterton or any of a number of other folks, right? So I suspect we do well to be a little bit reticent to incorporate, post 16th century saints, or say, post 1535 saints who may have played for other teams, right? But I suppose I think there's two useful things that can be held in tension here, and one of them is, as Liza says, I think in the eschaton, all of these labels and identities are going to fall away, right? The flip side is, to the degree that these are our family stories, we might choose to preserve the story of some saints from our little backwater, that somebody in, the church in East Syria might think is just really of no interest to them, but they might be to us, and that's okay, right? Was it Cuthbert who had the sea otters? I mean, we might have these charming stories that we want to preserve of saints who made a difference in their particular corner, but other folks might not have any interest. So I think there's a useful tension between the two. I wouldn't use the language of obligation. I think I would say, just as we encourage local observance, so each national church might choose to have its own saints. I'm going to go there. Charles I is in the calendar of the Church of England, and I can think of few more poisonous that we might choose to include in ours, in terms of the way that the calendar might be received at General Convention, right? So we might choose not to include him, and that would be okay.
It's also interesting, for example, Maria Skap, who is in the 2018 edition of Lesser Feast and Fast, who is actually behind me is a dancing saint icon, and was put on the walls of St. Gregory's actually before she was added to the calendar of the Orthodox Church, which is in 2004, I believe. So there's a sort of we don't want to fast track, or do we want to fast track those who might not be fast tracked, and I'm saying fast track, probably the wrong word, adding to our calendar before they're added to their own denominational calendars. And there were probably reasons the Orthodox shied away from Maria Skap, but those might not adhere as strongly to Episcopalians.
Yeah, I mean, the other example that came up a lot, and I'm sure will continue to be discussed, is Dorothy Day. And, that's one where I think there's a lot of support in general in the Episcopal Church for adding her. On a purely practical level, if you would like to see her added by her own church, having us add her to our calendar, honestly, does not help her cause. Right. And so, there is, there's some ecumenical politics with all of this, as well as, it's not only a question of who do you think is definitely in heaven in the community of saints. It's also a question of what is it actually helpful for us to formally add to our calendar as an official observance?
Yeah.
Right.
And again, in the same way, I wouldn't want to be held hostage to the politics of the Vatican in terms of when we put Dorothy Day in. So it's that delicate sort of walk. We might recognize sanctity there in someone who is part of that, ecumenical cloud of witnesses, and the vision in their home denomination might be obscured.
Yeah, and we did add Oscar Romero before the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's not like this is unprecedented. We have done it before.
It raises the question about we've been talking about already, the sort of theology of saints in the Anglican theological tradition, and I wonder if there's a way of articulating more specifically the Episcopal Church's theology of the saint, as opposed to a sort of generic Anglican sense.
I'm going to be Donish and say that the fact that we've had such a hot mess with our calendar from 2000 or after 2006, Lesser Feasts and Fasts came out onwards, suggests that there is no coherent theology of sainthood in the Episcopal Church, or rather that we each think that our own is coherent. But when General Convention meets in solemn assembly, we find that there are a whole bunch of different coherent theologies. But that's me being a little, pointed maybe.
No, I would agree. But I would actually say in some ways, I genuinely don't think that's a problem as long as we acknowledge it. There are so many areas now where Anglicans used to have consensus, about which we no longer seem to have consensus. And the theology of the sanctoral calendar is not one that we ever had consensus on in the first place. And so the idea that we are going to come up with a coherent theology of the calendar that we're all going to sign on to, I find that sort of incredibly naive and sort of charming, but not very realistic.
Mhm.
And so I think in some ways, like what you need in a book is something that's stretchy enough that you can use it with a number of different sanctoral theologies. Because I think that there's a number of different theologies of the calendar that are all actually authentically Anglican. They're all coherent in their own right. And there may be, each one of those would have some people who wouldn't make sense on other people's calendars, but there is actually a large section of folks in the middle who would make sense on all of these calendars. So, it might mean that someone like me, for example, I cannot have Saint Expedite because guess what? He didn't exist. I love this saint. I accept the fact, however, that like this is out of bounds for most Anglicans. But it also means that like, you have someone like John Calvin, who's been on our calendar. That's another one where, if your criteria for being on the calendar is simply importance in Christian history, then sure, he belongs. But I would argue that that's not one that's stretchy enough to accommodate the range of Anglican views on sainthood. And yeah.
Oh, no, go ahead.
No, I think basically that's it. I was just going to say, in some ways, it's the same with Charles the Martyr. Unlike you, I am delighted that we have a devotional society that does that. But I don't think that's a stretchy commemoration. And so, to me, we have a whole bunch of these people who are appropriately commemorated within some theologies of the calendar, but because they're not able to be used within all of the different theologies that are all appropriately Anglican, then they're not appropriate for inclusion on sort of a universal document. But since we've talked about like local commemoration is a really real, recognized, robust thing, that's also not a problem.
Right. Well, and I think this is where the set of criteria that we have been working with from General Convention, gosh, was it 2009 or thereabouts, sets, I think, a set of parameters that cover the stretchy. And there are some who just don't make the grade there, but it's a fairly inclusive set of criteria. And then the fact that these are all optional observance means that if you really just are Cranmerian in your view of who's in and who's out, the list of majors is all you need. The holy days out of the prayer book, and leave the rest to those who want to indulge in such things. Yeah.
Yeah. And, this is an area where people actually have a lot of liturgical discretion. And what was fascinating to me, actually, when I was secretary of the SCLM and getting all of the correspondence that people would send, which was delightful. But what was fascinating is that for a church that in general wants to have liturgical discretion and do whatever we want to do, people would get genuinely distressed if I would tell them that they had a choice. And like people wanted rules. And it's like, no, I'm actually telling you that this is an appropriate exercise of your Christian freedom. And like there is options here. We don't have to have rules about absolutely everything. And so people's anxiety about having multiple people on a day where then you have to choose. Oh my goodness. Like how could we ever possibly make a choice between two commemorations? And it's like, well, of all of the areas in liturgy, I mean, this actually is one in which there's tremendous scope for choice from the tradition.
There's a question that relates, I think, to what you're just saying, Liza, from Bob Sullivan. Given that the vast majority of parishes do not even observe the major feasts, which I understand page 15 to say are mandatory, why are we spending so much time on a topic that is fairly irrelevant to most communities? If it's not a major feast, it's always optional anyway. Where does that leave any sort of a calendar except for the few communities, a few dozen, that have even one regular weekday Eucharist anyway?
Yeah, well, this is interesting because I've mostly been in daily mass parishes, but the truth is that most of them have their own sanctoral and they do what they want to do, and they often don't really care what the church has officially done anyway. But I honestly have come to believe that the reason this question has been so fraught is that we're not actually fighting about the calendar. We're fighting about Anglican identity and who we are as a church and who we want to be as a church. And so, so many of the messages that I would field as secretary, I'd have people just being vile gender, about race, about ordination status, but also people tremendously and genuinely anxious about all of those questions because they couldn't see themselves in the calendar. And either way, what was going on was a question about who are we as a church? Are we mostly a white English church with a lot of sort of obscure Anglo-Saxon bishops? Are we a church that is much more fully representative in terms of race and gender and ordination status, even if that means looking beyond the bounds of Anglicanism? Because honestly, that is where we got most of our diversity on the calendar, is mining other traditions. I mean, we could find some within Anglicanism, but the truth is, like if you want Latino and Latina saints, for the most part, we're going to be stealing from the Roman calendar. And that's just the reality of it, for example. And so, my favorite comment, by the way, I want this in my obituary and on my tombstone. My favorite comment was that Lesser Feast and Fast 2018 had caused an infestation of women into the liturgical life of the church. And I am just claiming that as the new collective noun. You've got a gaggle of geese, you've got a conspiracy of ravens, a murder of crows or whatever, and you've got an infestation of women. But, when I got emails like that, it was sort of like, are we still fighting about the calendar? Because I was talking about the calendar and we've definitely moved on into other territory here. And so the calendar becomes a proxy for all of these debates about who we are as a church and who we aspire to be as a church. And the poor little sanctoral calendar was not meant to bear that kind of weight.
Yeah.
That, I can only say amen. Would you like some more questions from our participants?
That was such a straight pitch across the plate. Liza knocked that one out of the park. Let's take another pitch.
Let's take another one. This is from Susan Anslow Williams, who is a member of the SCLM and is actually the chair of the subcommittee.
Of the subcommittee, yes.
Asks, it's sort of a two-part question. Is it ever appropriate to remove persons from the calendar who, in the 21st century, no longer generate enthusiasm or whose holiness of life turns out to have been a mixed bag? In a later comment, Susan says, if no one today finds them exemplary or helpful to their understanding of the divine or the kingdom, why add them? Jim?
Well, I would say that actually you see a lot of this in history, that there's a sort of natural pruning that happens certainly before you codified the calendar from Trent onwards. But then, in many ways, what Cranmer was doing was saying, Saint Swithin, who the hell cares about Saint Swithin, other than it's a great sort of name for a parish that liturgy professors use in lecture because he sounds so ludicrous. Now, Swithin was no doubt a great and holy person, but I think there is a natural pruning that takes place, and where we run into the issues around this, I think, are that the folks who do not have appeal in my corner of the world might still be deeply held by somebody else, and this is where optional observance maybe is the sort of intermediate step, but eventually, I think I saw something in the chat about putting the saint on the injured reserve. And I would be fine with that, or send them down to the minors until they finish their rehab, and then you can call them back up, to extend the baseball metaphor. I think there's nothing wrong with that. The other thing is we do run into folks where we learn a bit more, and this is complicated, right? Because the saints are not perfect, right? There's actually the great novel by Frederick Buechner, Godric, right, which it sort of plays with this disjuncture between the life of the actual person and the representation in hagiography, and the person/saint's own discomfort with that. I think everybody would agree that Martin Luther King Jr. belongs in the calendar of saints. He wasn't perfect, and we know that, not least because his FBI file was released, right? So that doesn't erode the sanctity there. So the question would be, what is the preponderance, maybe? I think looking for perfection or numbers of miracles, I think that's silly. But you might have someone who's credibly accused of something monstrous, and we might then say, no, this person doesn't belong in the calendar. We didn't have the whole story. You know, I suspect we have a fair number of saints we might go run through the filtration system in light of more recent historiography, and we might just drop them.
Yeah.
Liza?
I would just add a couple of things. One is that sometimes when a saint no longer resonates, the problem isn't actually the commemoration, the problem is the bio. And, you know, sometimes it is the case that the problem is not that the 10th century bishop no longer resonates, it's just the bio from the 1950s no longer resonates. And so sometimes there actually is real work that can be done just in the biographies of these people in terms of translating them in ways that are helpful for a modern audience. But I do think we do need to have a mechanism for removing people, either just because they no longer resonate or because there have been problems. And I can tell you, I know of at least 2 times we've done it. And both times it was completely unofficial because there is no process for removing someone. So, yeah, I mean, the more recent one was George Bell,
Right.
where, you know, information did come out. And it's not that we were saying George Bell is definitely not in the kingdom of heaven. No one is saying that. But, you know, we are saying in some ways, right now, this is a scandal to the church, because this issue is too new and too fraught. And so it's simply not helpful right now. The other one, I don't know if Jim knows this or not, but the other one that was just sort of quietly taken out by the liturgists of the SCLM a couple decades ago was Hippolytus, which I wildly approve of. You know, not a fan personally. But again, no procedure to remove him. It was just sort of like quietly done on the committee level, and I think nobody noticed, which suggests that like maybe nobody cared. You know, if there doesn't seem to have been any uproar about this.
He didn't have a diocese voting for him in the Lent Madness, right?
Yeah.
So that's the thing.
So, you know, it is, that's not a great way of handling things. Like we do need a better mechanism rather than just sort of like the secretary accidentally clicked highlight and delete and oops, oh, I guess it's just gone. I don't know how that happened.
There's another question which I think leans into a tradition around making saints, which has to do with miraculous events in their lives. Kelly asks, how do you think the 20th and 21st century contention over saints might be connected to simultaneously shifting views about miracles and resurrection?
I would distinguish miracles from resurrection, right? So good Protestants of the period that I study, 16th, 17th century, would say that the age of miracles had ceased, right? And yet they did not in any way doubt the bodily resurrection of Jesus and the premise that we will follow. So I would just sort of pull the two apart. I think the question here would be, was the testimony of miracles really what defined a saint in, you know, for me, where I always look back to the early church? And the answer was no. And so that seems to be a later invention in a different part of the tradition. So I would, you know, I would say we don't necessarily ascribe the issue to miracles, you know, our acceptance of or rejection of the premise. But the thing about miracles, right, and the whole Roman system is it gives you a system, right? And so there's agreed upon criteria, you run everybody through, you look for that second miracle, and bang, there you go. And for us, with a murkier system, we don't have those clean criteria. But I'm curious what you think, Liza.
Yeah, well, no, I completely agree with that. And I will say, like, even in the bios of saints, this is something that we tried to be pretty careful about in writing the bios, was to, in general, downplay that, not because some of us don't totally believe it. I love all that stuff. But because it's not necessarily the most important thing in
Mhm.
terms of holding someone up as an exemplary Christian witness.
Yeah.
And so it's, I mean, it's not universally agreed upon oftentimes within the church, but it's not the main thing. It can be distracting in a certain sense. And so, even for those of us who quite like miracles and have no problem with believing in that as a thing, it's not necessarily the most spiritually relevant or helpful to be like, and here's all the cool things the saint can do for you if you pray to them, right?
I don't want to have to go over and pry open Charles Quintard's sepulcher and see if he's decomposed or not, if that's okay.
Yeah,
I'd
yep.
rather use other criteria. And Quintard has his own issues. I'm not seriously proposing him for sainthood, though I know he has been
It's been done.
up in the past. Yeah.
Liza, there's a follow-up question to something you said just a moment ago from Josh Huber. I'm really interested in this written bio versus life distinction. Can you think of a good example of a saint where the way the bio is presented is the problem?
Oh boy. Um, well, let's see. Who was it? Was it? Well, it was partly even, I think, the collect for Alcuin that started out like, like, oh Lord God, in a rude and barbarous age, you've raised up Alcuin. And it was sort of like, I don't know if 21st century Americans get to be calling anybody else rude and barbarous. But it's,
Or the
yeah.
martyrs?
In general, I think a lot of our sort of like older collects of English saints tend to, I think we've done some good work on this, but I think they just tended to not be sort of like winsome and charming and helpful. It was just sort of like, well, he grew up and he was very pious, and then he became a bishop and he was a good bishop and he actually visited his parishes and nobody else did, the end. And it's just sort of like, that doesn't, I mean, sure, but that's not a very helpful way of telling it. Another example, and this, you could argue that maybe this is even disingenuous, but like, with someone like Catherine of Genoa, we deliberately wrote that entire bio and didn't mention any of like the visions of purgatory, right? Because that's not the part that's helpful for Anglicans. Instead, we talked about the experience of God's grace and becoming aware of God's forgiveness and the transformation of her life and vocation in terms of working in a hospital. And like those parts of her life and witness that actually really do resonate. But you could write the bio of the same saint that would sound totally different. And a project I would actually really love to do in some ways would be sort of like looking back at the history of the bios and what different people who worked on the bios chose to put in. So something like Teresa of Avila, when I inherited that one, the whole thing was basically about her struggles with illness and trying to live her vocation as a nun when she kept getting sick. And I was sort of like, is that the main thing? I never would have thought that was the main thing. So like, I kept that, but I added in all this stuff about how she was always whining about having to write, and that would, wrote her book in like 60 days and was always complaining that she'd rather be doing something useful like peeling potatoes, and everyone made her write books. Because that's the part that resonates for me, right? So it's like you can have an identical saint, but the different people are going to narrate that story differently. And so I think about this a lot, honestly, as a history professor, in terms of like, how do I narrate the past in ways that make it sing for modern students and make it resonate? And there are definitely ways to do that, but it does change based on historical era.
I'm also thinking about we've received proposals to update the biography of Absalom Jones to make it more historically accurate and less pejorative, frankly. So, I mean, I think that, and it's an interesting thing because it sets the saints in living history as opposed to a kind of distant history that we don't ever comment on.
How do we write the bio of a saint like Absalom Jones? Or in the chat, I noticed David Pendleton Okahader was pointed out. How do we write the bio of those saints from the perspective of those communities from which they emerged instead of, let's say white, male, straight, middle-aged, academic guys, right? How do you convey who that person was to their community with an insider's narrative instead of an outside angle?
Yeah, and this is
I
in
think,
some ways why
you're
we,
seeing people say involve folks from that community, right? In the
yeah.
right. Um,
Yeah, because and in any given iteration of the SCLM, there's only so much depth of knowledge you can have. I mean, I can tell you, I'm much happier with the state of bios and collects for ancient and medieval folk in Lesser Feast and Fast 2018, because that's what I know. And so it's here I know what I'm doing. When we get to the 20th century, I'm sort of it happened. Most of my knowledge of it comes from the previous editions of Lesser Feast and Fast. So I'm not your authority here. And so, no one person or no committee of 3 people is going to have the depth of knowledge and experience to do all of that.
And they did try to cast the net wider in Holy Women, Holy Men, and drew in a number of folks to write. The difficulty with Holy Women, Holy Men was separate from the question of the writing team, maybe.
Jim, there's a question to you from Thomas Alexander.
Mm-hmm.
2020 is yearning for the Episcopal Church to dig deeper into our own history. Movements across the country are begging us to do this work. Jim, can you speak to some of the School of Theology's recent experience of this intersection?
Yeah.
Digging into one's own history, the work of racial reconciliation, and the practice of liturgical commemoration.
Yeah.
How can liturgical commemorations help us to do this work?
And I think, let me answer that 2 ways. And the first is to take the sort of 30,000-foot view and say that this is maybe an example of letting, or better yet, encouraging local communities to do their own work, digging into their history. And then perhaps coming out of that, there may be something that resonates beyond that local community, or it may be something that is just good for that community alone. So the School of Theology, where I teach, is situated in a larger university that from its founding was slavery's university. 1858, the whole premise of the charter was this was going to be a college where young gentlemen, using the term advisedly, of the South could be educated without the danger of picking up abolitionist ideas had they gone to a place as far north as the University of Virginia, right? So the Civil War intervenes, you have a refounding of the university afterwards, and what happens there is it's largely with the profits of the institution of slavery that the university is repurposed, refounded. Anybody who knows the history of this part of the world also knows you didn't flip a switch in 1865 and suddenly get racial equality. So there's a whole lot of race-based oppression that unfolds over the succeeding decades. So the university as a whole, some years back, put together a project that would examine the history of the institution with an unflinching gaze, and it's really the truth-telling part of what we hope will be truth and reconciliation. But the premise was you have to do the truth-telling first. So we've gone and looked at the unsavory history of the institution, of the donors, of the founders, and done that work telling ourselves the real story about ourselves. In terms of commemorations, what we've started to do is to commemorate some of the folks who were often against the institution's own desires, the folks who dragged us out of that previous posture and into what we hope and pray and believe is a less awful one. So we just did a commemoration a couple of Wednesdays back of the faculty of the School of Theology who all resigned en masse except for one. That would be the liturgy professor. back in 1953 because the university refused to desegregate even after the Episcopal Church had told them they had to. And then about a year later, the university did vote to desegregate. We also unveiled the portrait of our first African-American graduate, Father Joseph Green, civil rights leader, civic leader, and longtime rector in Norfolk, Virginia, unveiled his portrait as a way of holding him up as an example, and as the Vice Chancellor, our president, said, as one of our founding fathers, graduated in 1965. So we're trying to commemorate, to elevate the folks who did right. It also means telling that story unflinchingly, so saying outright, the faculty resigned because the institution refused to do what was right. Father Green, we commemorate because he persevered even though people were trying to chase him out. We're trying to tell the story of these particular heroes in a way that does not let the institution off the hook, as opposed to Father Green graduated and so everything's okay. Which is not true, right? So how does that bear on what we might do as a church? I think maybe it points back perhaps to those bios that Liza was pointing to and saying, you know, maybe we need to be, you can be hagiographical of the saint, but maybe the institutional church doesn't need to get a pass. Maybe we call out you know, white supremacist behavior, for example, in the rewrite of the Absalom Jones bio, right? And so forth. So I think what we're doing locally, and I hope I'm answering Thomas's question on target as opposed to straying off, but using commemoration and celebration to celebrate those who pushed us to do right, but at the same time acknowledging how we, the institution, made it so hard for them.
Thank you for that. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 really good questions. And we have less than 30 minutes. And these are not targeted to either you specifically. Kelly asked, can you talk about why we have so few fasts?
So we tried to fix this. and I mean, you guys, all three of us can testify, right? We tried a couple of different ways too. And so, yeah, I mean, you want to take this one, Liza?
Yeah, well, I mean, the short answer is that like people don't necessarily want them. I mean, the thing I was the most proud of from General Convention 2018 was that, you know, we actually passed a resolution saying add more fasts, and we did it on the consent calendar, which, you know, I think if we'd actually debated that, a lot of people would have been like, no, we don't want that, actually. We don't want more fasts. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I actually do think this is something we need more of, especially as we're grappling with many of the ways in which our institutions and us individually have failed. And, you know, if you treat the calendar just sort of like endless celebration after endless celebration and sort of ways we can feel good about ourselves, it's like, well, what kind of work is that doing in terms of formation? And, you know, even thinking, you know, I'm very frustrated in general with the whole sort of criteria of firstness that we use in the calendar. And so first women priest, first Black priest. You know, I want to hear that they were good at it. I don't just care so much who was the first, right? That just gets too much into the important thing. But, you know, what if rather than sort of like congratulating ourselves for ordaining women, we instead repented of all of the ways in which we didn't acknowledge women's gifts for so long, right? And we can just end up with a calendar where all we sort of do is pat ourselves on the back and be like, look at all of the very good, very inclusive things we've done. And it's like, well, yeah, but we've also often failed. But you know, even things that like we technically already have, like the Rogation Days and the Ember Days that are wildly neglected, I think are needed more than ever. You know, I mean, especially Rogation Days. I'm just like, we're destroying the planet. We've got a pandemic. Like, what better time to really bring those back with a vengeance? But, you know, honestly, I think it's just people don't like fasting. They're like, oh
Well,
no, that sounds like something we wouldn't want to do.
and what is a fast day? So again, you know, if all you have is a hammer, everything's a nail. So I go back to my 16th and 17th century folks, and you know, for them, of a certain type of fast day was going to church basically all day and hearing really long sermons, right? And engaged in godly spiritual exercises. For other you know, points in the period, it's abstention from food or anything that would be fun. And then is a fast preparatory, or is it freestanding? And is it in response to particular issues, right, which might be temporary conditions, or is it a sort of long-standing one? So an example of the long-standing is January 30th, where we repent for shortening Charles I by 11 inches off the top, and you know, upending the settled order of monarchy, et cetera, et cetera. But conversely, you could have a fast day to avert the plague, right? Or you might have, we might say we would have a fast day for a certain number of years to commemorate our fail and repent of our failure to elevate women in the church, until a certain point where then perhaps the church might, in, you know, Holy Council, sit and say, well, okay, we've worked that off. And now we can, and then, you know, the other example would be how many of us fast prior to receiving communion? What is our Lenten fast like as a preparatory fast? You know, the old maxim is that Sundays are never a fast day, even in Lent, so you somewhat relax the fast. But if the only churchy content we're getting in us is on Sundays, are we fasting the other 6 days that week, right? And have we missed something, right? So
Plus, you know, it's increasingly, you know, the trendy thing that instead of, you know, giving up something like alcohol or meat or whatever for Lent, people do something like give up gossip. But then, like, if you do that, you can't take Sundays off, right? You can't just be like, oh, well, it's Sunday, so now I get to have all of the gossip.
you
So
save everything up and then you get to share it at coffee hour. That is an observable phenomenon, but it's not a good one.
yeah. And so it's like when we sort of make the things that you're giving up, when we treat those as, when we use sins rather than things that are good, but which you might want to discipline yourself from for a while, then you end up with a completely different understanding of what it even means to be fasting in the first place. I mean, we're supposed to be fasting from sin all the time. So
That is the goal.
There are two questions which I'm going to pair up. Amy asks, how can the calendar of saints contribute to formation when precious few people, quote, want to be one too? And Marty Burnett, hi Marty, we went to junior high together. Marty Burnett says, what are some practical suggestions in addition to Lent madness that could increase engagement and familiarity with the calendar of saints?
Here's where I would put in a plug for the daily Eucharist. Because properly, you know, we do our best when we stick to the daily office lectionary. You can always include the collect of the day out of lesser feasts and fasts, but you know, the Cranmer's idea of Bible study is really what drives the daily office in Anglicanism. But the daily Eucharist is a great way to, again, back full circle to where I really started my engaged life as a Christian, Dorsey McConnell, reading the bio of the saint out of Lesser Feasts and Fasts, and then observing that saint in the in the collect and lections. How do we use this as a tool of formation? One of the things that I'm always struck by, and this goes to, and here I'm going to wave a red flag in front of Liza. This is in the discourse about confirmation. So Aidan Kavanaugh said, you know, part of the difficulty with confirmation is it's often a liturgical solution to a pedagogical problem. Let's transpose that and say, Now, formation is bigger than pedagogy, right? And so formation includes our liturgical life, our prayer life. But ultimately, what we do in the liturgy cannot substitute for the pedagogy that happens outside of the liturgy. So it can be a part of the way we engage in these things, but it won't be the fullness of it.
Yeah. And I mean, I would have to say that I don't think the primary purpose of liturgy is pedagogical. I mean, when you participate in it daily, it does absolutely have a formative effect on you. Like I was ruthlessly hard on the tradition of the autobiographical collect that we
Oh,
sort
God,
of
yes.
inherited, that was sort of like, oh God, whose saint so-and-so did X, Y, and Z, please do A, B, and C for us.
Yeah.
I just cannot even. So a lot of those are dead. Because then it's like, to whom are you speaking? Are you actually speaking to God, in which case God knows, or are you trying to give the congregation a history lesson? And I don't think that that's really the primary purpose of the liturgy. Yeah.
The liturgy is about celebration and commemoration, but it's not, it may teach, but it's not a teaching moment, right? There's a delicate line to be walked there.
An SCLM member, Deacon Stan Baker asks, can one of you comment on calendar days for groups of saints, as in the proposed calendar days for deaconesses?
Yeah. So one of the things that is important to me in a calendar is that we're commemorating actual people and specific people. And so one of the devices that to me seems to work is when you have someone that you are commemorating in the calendar who then has attached to them the energy and enthusiasm of other folks in that category, right? And so you remember a particular deaconess for her saintly life and her heroic witness, but then it can become an opportunity to elevate all deaconesses through the history of the church. So what I get nervous about is when we have like a deaconess's day without a name, right? Let's take, Lawrence the deacon was a particular deacon, a heroic deacon, griddled alive. The Romans are torturing him, and he calls out from the gridiron, I'm done on this side, you better turn me over, right? I mean, what a way to go out with style, right? He's a great icon of the diaconate. But we don't have just a day in the calendar for all deacons. So generic categories aren't as helpful as having a specific person that we can currently use to remember others. Now, I would say the flip side of that is you can have propers for commemorating, generic commons. So the common of a musician. Well, you use that when you're remembering Bach, if you don't want to use what was in Holy Women, Holy Men, or for scholars, use that maybe if you want to remember, I don't know who, Saint Reinhold Niebuhr, right? Not saying seriously that that's a proposal in front of SCLM, but you could use the proper for a theologian. What you wouldn't do is say, we're going to today remember all theologians who've gone on before us. So that you sometimes see the generic commons, but they're meant to commemorate particular people.
Yeah, I have very little to add to that. I mean, basically, I think you need an individual to serve as an icon, because ultimately we're venerating people, we're not venerating concepts.
Yeah.
But yeah, Jim said this very well.
Good. Here's a question from Sarah McDonald. How do we make our calendar more diverse and not sanitized with a white lens?
Well, I think we were talking about this a little bit earlier in the sense of getting folks from the communities from which folks emerged to have a hand in writing the biography and the collect, but also encouraging them to propose commemorations in the first place. So there's the sanitized white lens of how the commemoration is set up, the collect, the bios, the readings. There's also then who gets included in the first place. And so how do we encourage folks to cast a wide net. I do think we do well when we look at the global church. One of the examples that we were batting around in a recent SCLM meeting, the Ethiopian Eunuch is commemorated in many of the churches of the East. He's not for us. Why not? Actually, if you look at the story, he seems to be much more interesting than Philip. And then there's a whole narrative history around him, how much is true and how much is not. You know, I'm not a scholar of the period, not my century, but you know, there's some real interesting material that we could pick up and run with to commemorate this person who really heard the, you know, looked at the scroll, was puzzling through it, took the initiative, and ultimately sought baptism, and then, you know, as legend has it, goes on to live a saintly life. So I think if we look at other parts of global Christianity, we can help address that.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think in some ways, the biggest question, which we did already touch on a bit, but it often just becomes a question of how willing are you to go outside of Anglicanism? Because the global church, both presently but also historically, has been tremendously diverse. I mean, you know, you had Christians in China before England had an Archbishop of Canterbury. So we often have this very Western narrative in our minds and think that world Christianity just like happened in the 20th century. But there is a lot there, but it does sometimes mean looking beyond our own tradition. I'm personally very comfortable doing that, but it is a debate.
So I'm looking at a Google Doc, which is shared with my co-conveners for this event, and they keep changing the questions that people are asking. They keep not changing, they keep moving them around. So I'm going to go to this one from Jessica Nelson, who's also an SCLM member. How does one make a compelling case to the SCLM for inclusion in the calendar?
Oh dear, honestly, and I'm no longer on the SCLM, but I think honestly, the SCLM is like so burned out in general with people swamping them with commemorations. I think you want to demonstrate that you have an actual tradition of local commemoration of something that's happening. And it is tremendously helpful if you already have drafted propers and a bio and a collect, rather than just telling the SCLM to go do research on somebody and come up with something. You know, there might be a lot to be said for temporarily fasting from new commemorations until we figure out just exactly what it is that we're doing with this document called the calendar. But you know, the number of commemorations has increased every triennium for decades now, and it shows no signs of stopping. So whatever path the church takes with its calendar in the future, I don't think we're going back. I mean, I don't see any signs that this momentum is stopping.
Well, we tried this, Liza, when you did your Cranmerian revision, and yeah, nobody wants to give up their saint.
Yeah. And here's, I mean, in some ways, this is my big regret, honestly, of 2018, is that I didn't explicitly name that what I was doing was making the Roman general calendar. And I didn't want to use that terminology because I knew it would freak people out. Yeah. But if people weren't on the core list, everyone read that as being deleted. And, you know, it was not our intention to delete anybody. We were trying to make a more narrow core list of, you know, universal commemorations, and then a much wider net of all of the people in the saints, which honestly is exactly the kind of thing that the Catholic and Orthodox churches and churches that have way more saints than we've historically had, that is how they do it. But I was so afraid that if I said the words like, let's be like the general Roman calendar, that would freak people out. But yeah, people thought that folks were sort of getting deleted or getting knocked out of the, you know, the communion of the saints. And it's like, well, no, we're just trying to like not observe literally every last person, and nobody wants to exercise discretion and choice. And so, you know, here's what we have.
Related from Kate Moorhead. How can we as liturgical leaders set the church free to embrace local saints in their own settings? Which I think is actually a really helpful question when it comes to the previous question from Jessica. I mean, how might a congregation make a saint?
Well, and I guess what I'm hearing is maybe something a little different. But maybe I'm mishearing what Kate's saying. If the question is how do we get the local community to do it, you just start observing the saint locally, and then gradually you encourage others to join in, then take it to the diocese, and eventually you move it up the chain. If the issue is how do we get folks to embrace the freedom that they already have, that's a sort of communications / pedagogical problem. If you go into most Episcopal churches and set, the 79 BCP down, it will fall open right to page 355. In a few places, it'll be what, 323, but most places it's 355, and this is back to that idea that was floated in 2018 of getting us to re-engage with the book that we have, because folks tend to skip past the provisions of optional observance, right? And then the commons, which are the two tools you have: optional observance to say it doesn't have to be observed, and then the commons, which say here's a set of propers and collects that you can use as you begin to commemorate locally. And then it's getting folks to read not just the bios and collects in Lesser Feasts and Fasts, but or Holy Women, Holy Men before it, and Great Cloud, etc. But to read all of the sort of liturgy nerd stuff that you, Liza, and I groove on, right? But that a lot of folks don't read about criteria for sainthood, encouraging local observance, and so forth. So I think some of this is, if diocesan liturgical observances, or sorry, diocesan liturgical commissions are really coming into being, getting them to foster local observances and really encourage and teach leaders in local communities about that flexibility and those options.
I sort of wonder if local communities feel insecure about doing it and don't feel like it's real unless the General Convention says it's real. And in fact, that would be the exact opposite of what developing a sanctoral cycle is, because nothing is more real than a local commemoration.
Right. Now,
Yeah.
I mean, you get local commemorations that go off the rails, like St. Guinfor. I had to mention St. Guinfor, Liza. The Holy Greyhound, right? Who, inquisitors find and say, look, we love you guys, but you cannot commemorate a dog as a saint. And so, rightly or wrongly, they remove Guinfor from the calendar. So you can get local commemorations that are a little bit odd, but that's why we have the general criteria. And
Right.
so if local communities are taught, look, use these criteria, evaluate your saint against these criteria, start your local observance, then there's a lot of opportunity for growth.
Yeah. And, I do think, people have a lot of freedom, but they don't have unlimited freedom. And, everyone sort of laughed at the beginning when I said that, like, they do have to be definitely Christian and definitely dead. But, I've received proposals when I was on the SCLM for adding both Catherine Jefferts Schori and Michael Curry as the first female and the first Black presiding bishop. But, like, they're both still very much alive.
Now, some of those medieval popes could solve that, but they had a more flexible moral system than we do today.
Yeah, so, but like in some ways, that's the state of education about the calendar, where it's become just a way to honor anyone we want to honor. And I think that is often then why the General Convention thing becomes so important, because we almost don't know how to honor people in any other way than to give them the official stamp of church approval by giving them their own feast day. And again, that's not really what the calendar is the appropriate tool for.
Right.
There's a question that relates somewhat. This is from Dana Kramer Rolls. How about dates of cultural importance? Diocese of California just approved Juneteenth as a commemoration, as a local commemoration. I mean, it moves off the sort of topic. The calendar is all about saints. It's also all about commemorations.
Yeah, by the way, I do just want to hold up my holy icon for Michael Rogers in the chat. So yes, I'm right there with you on adding a certain addition to to the calendar. I think the question about cultural observance is maybe wrapping back to what do we think about gunpowder treason, about Coronation Day, the accession of Elizabeth the First. Are those cases where the barrier between civic and religious is properly a permeable membrane, right? Or are those cases where it was important, but it was not churchy business? I can cast Juneteenth in a theological lens, but I don't know.
What about Independence Day? American Independence.
I would strip Independence Day right out of the calendar.
So would I.
I think that was, I would be happy to see that drop out, and I am grateful for the Vice President of the House of Deputies, who always sends a corrected collect out for us, right?
And the other important thing with all of those is to remember that we're not just an American church. And so, I can easily make the case for commemorating something like Juneteenth within the United States, but it doesn't make sense to me to add it as a commemoration for the entire Episcopal Church when that's not a history that's shared by many of our dioceses.
Yeah.
And same with American Thanksgiving. You can put a theological sheen on it, but again, that's an American holiday. And so why does that have to be on the prayer book of all of these other dioceses in the Episcopal
And there's
Church?
probably a continuum here, and we could probably situate some of these things at different points on the continuum, and then it would just be a question of where you draw the cutoff line.
We have 2 minutes left, and there are still some delightful questions that I wish we could get into. I'm afraid we're going to have to let them go for future consideration. Okay, I'll ask one more. What about the commemoration of Old Testament saints? Okay, you have 30 seconds.
The East does it, if I'm not mistaken.
The East does do it.
Who are we to argue? Here's the thing: would the saint in question, would we be doing violence to the person's integrity, or the way that others have interpreted that integrity, if we say this person was a proto-Christian, a Christian avant la lettre, right? That's not quite as bad as Mormon proxy baptism, but we just want to tread real carefully, I think.
Good.
Yeah. And I'm going to go ahead and say something wildly Anglo-Catholic just to get Jim all riled up right before we end. But in some ways, I only truly see the point of commemorating biblical saints at all if you're also including information that tradition gives us beyond what's just in the Bible. And when you're commemorating people for literally the only thing we've got is what's in the Bible, I'm like, we have the Bible for that. The Bible is wonderful for that. But I don't feel the need for a separate feast day unless I'm also getting additional information about this person that is not included within the Bible. And for most of the Old Testament saints, we don't have anything like that in tradition. We really just have what the Bible gives us. So for that, I think people should read the Bible.
Very good. Liza and Jim, thank you both so much for your participation. It has been a delight to share the screen with you. The conversation has been really, really wonderful. I want to let our participants know that we'll be back together tomorrow, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. The third plenary session will be about the task force on liturgical and prayer book revision with Neil Alexander and Cameron Partridge. And then tomorrow at 4 p.m., the fourth and final plenary will feature Juan Oliver and Jamon Taylor, who will be talking about the Book of Common Prayer. Sarah, do you have anything for us at the end of the day?
I dropped in the evaluation. So each of the evaluations are for separate webinars. So that way you can comment on Jim and Liza independently. And their content, of course, not just on them as people. So I'm going to drop that link in again. And hopefully, if everybody's keyboards work well tonight, you'll have the follow-up recordings for both of today's sessions in your inboxes at tomorrow morning.
Very good. Again, Liza and Jim, thank you so much.
Good to be with you all.
Anytime.
Are we done? We're done.
All right. Take care, y'all.
You too. Bye-bye.